friends. My name's Trish Robert, watching Faint Signals from Bega. So I went online just to check out Julian Assange's Twitter site. And for those of you who are not familiar with Julian Assange, he's a journalist, and I think he's founder of WikiLeaks, which is a journalist organization which often has whistleblowers coming to it to leak information, to whistleblow on governments and the military, etc. You might remember Chelsea Manning, who she was a whistleblower. She is a whistleblower, and she released the video Collateral Murder to WikiLeaks, and they released that to the world. She went to prison for 7 years, but she was sentenced to 35 years. This is what governments do now to whistleblowers. And it seems like the Australian government is, as one would expect these days, a US lackey. Julian Assange has been in the he's been in the Ecuadorian embassy now in London for 6 years, and in recent times, the last 50 days or so, he's been the Ecuadorian embassy, whose leadership has Ecuador, whose leadership has changed recently, has obviously sided with the US empire and is trying to make it as untenable for him, Julian Assange, in this embassy as possible. And so he's in sort of a dire shape because they've stopped all forms of communication except for his lawyer now. He can't be online, he can't receive telephone calls, he can't receive visitors except for his lawyer, and even that, his lawyer and his conversations with his lawyer are surveilled. So this is, an untenable situation for a human being. And I'm sort of appalled at my government, the Australian government. I ring up on occasion, even though I know it's going to be futile, but I ring up, say, the office of Bill Shorten. I don't bother with the Prime Minister's office because they're just so much, they'll just do whatever the US government wants them to do. And I can probably say that for the opposition, the ALP, the Australian Labor Party, who is definitely just a neoliberal party who just follows whatever the US government wants them to. Because I rang up Bill Shorten's office, and somebody who was really just a flat catcher, who was actually quite adversarial toward me and was sort of basically appeared to not care at all about Julian Assange, and was sort of a bit smarmy on it, and said I was rude to him, when really all I was doing was actually pointing out that the Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, and the fact that Penny Wong, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, hasn't mentioned anything about Julian Assange being in this even more dire situation in the Ecuadorian embassy, just sort of shows who rules them, really. You can tell who rules politicians by who they won't criticize. And so Penny Wong, unfortunately, has not said anything about Julian Assange that I know of for a very long time in social media. I don't think she's probably said much in Parliament either. And Bill Shorten is just as bad. And just as a side note, the recent massacre that happened with the Palestinians in the Great March of Return in the apartheid state of Israel, the Australian government has blocked, along with the US government, no surprises there, an inquiry into that massacre. Not that it's going to make that much difference in another inquiry. I don't know how many there've been now. They continue to massacre Palestinians in the apartheid state of Israel. And, Bill Shorten, the leader of the opposition, who might one day be the Prime Minister of Australia, He takes photo opportunities with Netanyahu, who is just a genocidal white supremacist criminal, really. Of course, there's no mention of Yemen. There's a genocide happening in Yemen right now. And it's backed, it's not only backed by the US, but the US is literally sort of involved directly in this genocide in Yemen with helping Saudi Arabia, refueling their planes and all that sort of thing. It's a completely, they're completely fine with it. And I don't know of any politician yet. Maybe there is one, but I don't know, maybe the Greens have said something, I don't know. But nobody's mentioned anything about this ongoing genocide as far as I know. And if they have, then it's it was ages ago and it's still ongoing. And this is the situation we have in Australia and, you know, the US as well. This is what we are now. Our governments are just a sort of warmongering, neoliberal oligarchs in a way, or heading toward that oligarchy, if they haven't already become one. You know, it's just a sort of an appalling situation. And so Penny Wong's office, when I rang them up today about Julian Assange, and I said, what is Penny Wong? What has she said about Julian Assange? And the best that the person would say is she can decide what she comments on and what she doesn't comment on. And I said, you realize Julian Assange is an Australian, and that you realize his situation. He's been in this embassy now for 6 years, and if he leaves, he'll be arrested by the US and they'll put him in prison. They'll possibly torture him and they'll throw away the key. He won't be as lucky as Chelsea Manning, who wasn't lucky, by the way. She suffered terribly. It's torture, you know. She was put in solitary confinement and all sorts of things, left naked. He won't be that lucky. So, you know, and the Australian government, both sides, both of the major parties, don't care. And by the way, last year, at the end of last year, Cassie O'Connor made some really unfortunate comments about Julian Assange, like he's a Russian troll and he's this and that. She said something very pejorative about him, I can't remember. This is Cassie O'Connor, head of the Tasmanian Greens. So this is the sort of leadership, in quotes, we have in Australia. Afraid to say anything about US empires, warmongering. Albanese, I'll have to give it to him, Anthony Albanese from the Australian Labor Party. He was somewhat appalled that Australia had, along with the US, blocked an inquiry into the recent massacre of Palestinians in the Great March of Return. So I'll give that to him. Why hasn't Bill Shorten said anything? The head of the opposition. Anyway, so this is the state of affairs. And, you know, so we had a hostile kind of a receptionist, you know, sort of a politely hostile adversarial receptionist in Bill Shorten's office. And we had, you know, the comment, well, Senator Wong, only she can decide who she, you know, what she comments on. In other words, you know, if she decides not to comment on an Australian citizen having all his rights taken from him, who's in danger of being extradited to the US and being thrown in prison and the key being thrown away, obviously she doesn't care. And this is a journalist, by the way. Journalists are, you know, if any of these people have forgotten what journalism is, it's supposed to be, journalists are supposed to hold government's feet to the fire. That's what they're supposed to do. Most of them now are just stenographers. The mainstream media in Australia are mostly stenographers. We don't have anything really like the Real News Network in Australia. I don't know of any real independent journalism that's really that has any sort of following that is able to report what's going on in Australia like like there is in the US. The US has got an appalling mainstream media, but they do have a few independent journalists like Abby Martin and Max Blumenthal and Rania Kalik and Ben Norton. Abby Martin does the wonderful Empire Files, which I hope that you look at. Empire Files, just put Empire Files in the search with host Abby Martin, and then put YouTube or wherever, and you should come up with amazing programs by Abby Martin and Michael Preisner, her partner. So please check that out, because that gives you a great insight into the appalling US empire and just the warmongering that they're doing, and backing Israel, $10 million a day to the apartheid state of Israel. Excuse me. So anyway, I'm very disillusioned. I'm not even sure, how many people care in Australia about Julian Assange. And here's the thing about Julian Assange. If the Australian government can do that to an Australian citizen, they can do that to anybody. They can abandon anybody that way, depending on what's convenient for them politically. So any Australian citizen should be appalled and should be very afraid of how the Australian government is dealing with him, and a journalist, by the way. And then on a wider scale, anybody globally should care about what's happening to Julian Assange. The UK government is quite happy to hand him over, really, if they could. It looks like the Ecuadorian embassy, Ecuador, the government there is quite happy to hand him over. And he won't see any, he'll have some sort of a pretend court trial, if that, and then they'll just throw him in prison for the rest of his life. And the reason being is because he's a threat to US empire, because he reveals whistleblowers, secrets, the secrets that of corruption, of which there are many. WikiLeaks has never been wrong about anything it's reported. And look how Hillary Clinton has spit the dummy over the Podesta emails. She's tried to make it all about Russia, where there's no evidence, by the way. If you look at NSA whistleblower William Binney, he says if they wanted to find out if Russia hacked their elections, they could find it out instantly with the NSA, because the NSA surveils all communications, in the United States. So it would be easy to find out. It was a leak, those Podesta emails by WikiLeaks. And it uncovered, the corruption of Hillary Clinton and her campaign, and how they'd elevated Trump because they thought, he would lose and she would win, and so on and so on. So, Julian Assange has made a lot of powerful enemies, and treating him this way is, they're trying to make an example of him so that no one else behaves, no one else does that. These are that's what they did to Chelsea Manning. They sentenced her to 35 years for simply revealing war crimes. She got out after 7. But this is how they treat people who are whistleblowers and people who are journalists. That's signs of a fascist state. So this is how they, these are fascist moves. These are fascist sorts of behaviors by these governments. And the Australian government should be ashamed, both sides. I mean, I wouldn't expect anything less of Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister, and people like Tony Abbott, and they're just, all they're interested in is pleasing corporations. They couldn't give a toss about the public, and they couldn't give a toss about, they'd be happy for Julian Assange to be locked up, because that means they'll never have anything, never have any, probably, well, they probably will, because it's not going to stop WikiLeaks if Julian Assange is thrown in prison. WikiLeaks will keep releasing information. But this is all a example setting, you know, so that people will think twice about whistleblowing or, you know, anything like that. So, and any of these people who go on trolling about Julian Assange, sort of making up, inventing stories. It's not about whether you like him or you don't like him. He's an Australian, he's a journalist, a real journalist and a hero. And if you're Australian and you're trolling and saying he's a rapist or whatever, that's been thrown out, right? And also, WikiLeaks has not released anything that isn't true. That isn't true. And you should care about that. And if you don't care about him, then you don't care about yourself, basically, because it never stops at that. You'll be on the receiving end, you know, that first they came for the trade unionists, then they came for the, you know, this and that, you know, from that Holocaust, that quote, famous quote. That's exactly what this is. People like Julian Assange are all of us. People like Chelsea Manning are all of us. Because if they can do that to that person, they can do it to anybody, and they will do it to anybody. So if you think that somehow this doesn't affect you and you don't care, then you're very, very mistaken, and it's a very, very unwise position to take. Even in a selfish sense, you should care. But one would hope that if you're an Australian citizen, you would care about somebody who is an Australian, who has done some heroic stuff. I mean, he's released information, even though he knew he'd make powerful enemies and they would try and get him. He continued to do that. That's the stuff that heroes are made of. That he's made himself so unpopular that they'll be happy to grab him and throw away the key. And all governments lie, so they're all happy, you know, for him to be taken away. They're all happy about that. You know, you don't hear really anybody in any governments particularly calling out for his release, really. Maybe there might be one or two, but no. So, you know, that says that all governments lie and they don't want journalists reporting on any corruption that they do, and they do so much of it now. Look at the look at the UK. What an appalling state that's in. So if you don't care about what's happening to Julian Assange, if you're not demonstrating or ringing up all these politicians and saying, I'm refusing to vote for you if you don't speak up and get him released back to Australia to safety. Give him his passport back and allow him to return to Australia. If you're not saying that, then firstly, for selfish reasons, you're being really stupid because, like I say, whatever happens to him can happen to anybody. You don't have to be a journalist for an approaching fascist state to just decide you're inconvenient for some reason. And if you haven't noticed, austerity is creeping into Australia, and that's the way of keeping people so occupied with surviving that they don't notice what the government is doing. So that's something you need to consider. We need to consider. And secondly, if you're not supporting him, then you're not supporting a democracy, basically, because journalists are supposed to hold government's feet to the fire. Otherwise, you end up with the mess we have now. We don't have any fourth estate that's real anymore. They're stenographers. They just take down the government narrative, and they also bang the drums of war. So, you know, if you want stenographers and if you want to end up in World War III, then, you know, just go on right ahead with what you're doing. But if you want a world that's peaceful, then you have to have people who will report on these politicians. You have to have a healthy fourth estate, otherwise you don't have a democracy. And that's where we are in Australia. We have a semblance of a democracy at this point because we don't have a healthy fourth estate at all. And that includes the ABC. The ABC is appalling now. It just reports the government narrative. Really, in a way, it doesn't, like, look at 7:30 report with Lee Sales. All she does now is puff pieces, interviews with Paul McCartney, interviews like human interest stories, maybe an occasional one that might be of some value. She interviewed war criminal Hillary Clinton, and you can look up the Empire Files Hillary Clinton and see all about Hillary Clinton, why she's a war criminal. She helped destroy Libya. Now it's in a state of complete chaos with people being sold as slaves. That's just one thing she's been involved in. The parties in the United States are just a duopoly. They're a warmongering, neoliberal, neocon duopoly who've now set their sights on Iran. They're a rogue state, which is the greatest threat to world peace. And this is what the Australian government is being a lackey to. Isn't that marvelous? Aren't you proud? Aren't you proud of being Australian and having this government behave like, have your government be a US lackey and just follow along with the warmongering? I mean, it's just one war on top of another. There's like 8+ wars they're involved in that they started, pretty much. And they're destroying these countries of these, it's a white supremacist war. They're destroying these countries, killing millions of brown people for resources and hegemony. And we're just trotting along behind them, the Australian government. Isn't it appalling? Aren't you appalled? I am. I'm appalled. Gough Whitlam would be appalled if he knew what was going on. And by the way, I've said this before, the CIA in 1975 helped get rid of Gough Whitlam. They admitted it. The CIA admitted that they helped get rid of Gough Whitlam. He was dismissed. Remember that? Yeah. So this is what they did to one of the best prime ministers there were, a socialist democratic prime minister who was great on indigenous rights, who free healthcare, free public education, and that wasn't okay for the US because, as you know, they're just they have no free healthcare. It's all corporate-owned insurance companies. Their lobbyists pay them off, and they don't want free healthcare. They don't want any sort of. I mean, students end up having massive debts. Well, Australia's going to end up like that too, like the US. Because we don't have any leaders like Gough Whitlam anymore. We don't have leaders like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. It's very sad. It makes me very sad. I'm old enough to remember Gough Whitlam. I was 15, I think, when he was removed, 1975, and we've never had a prime minister since. And in fact, the Australian Labor Party was the one that introduced a lot of these neoliberal policies. So anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. I hope that you will call out for the freedom of Julian Assange and for him to be returned to Australia with his passport and to be protected. We have to at least try. Because he is all of us. We're all Julian Assange. We are all Chelsea Manning. We are all the ones, and if we can't protect the most vulnerable, for example, the Palestinians or Julian Assange, then that says a lot about us, doesn't it? If it says a lot about politicians if they can't protect the most vulnerable in society. And by the way, that's why I'm vegan, because the most vulnerable on this planet are non-human sentient animals. So I invite you to really consider that, becoming vegan, because they're sentient animals. We don't need animal products to survive. We can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. So the only reason we have for exploiting 1 trillion land and aquatic animals every year is because we think they taste good, and that's morally unjustifiable. And also it's killing the planet. Animal agriculture is responsible for 51% of greenhouse gases. So we really, really need to think about that too. How we treat the most vulnerable on the planet, that being non-human animals, it doesn't stop there. We end up doing the same things to other vulnerable groups. And this is a great example. The Palestinians are a great example of treating them like that. So anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. And if you're interested in becoming vegan, I have a site, howtogovegan.org. So check that out, please, howtogovegan.org. Anyway, my name's Trish Roberts. Thanks very much for watching. Please speak out for Julian Assange. He needs our help, particularly in Australia. He needs all Australians to demonstrate and to insist that these morally spineless, no offense to invertebrates, but morally spineless politicians to speak out for their own citizen. So thanks for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.